Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight on the second day of NENA's Housing Week for 2022. My name is Michelle Maloney. I'm one of the co-founders and directors of the New Economy Network Australia. We're really pleased to be working in partnership with Co-Housing Australia to host this week of very important conversations and discussions about what many of us refer to as Australia's housing crisis. We're very concerned about issues such as access to affordable housing, access to safe and healthy housing, many concerns about homelessness, about young people and older women, all of the folks who are vulnerable and affected by what we see as Australia's crazy, unnecessary, high-priced housing stock. And I'll acknowledge country in a moment, but I certainly want to acknowledge our guest speaker tonight, which is the wonderful Professor Louise Crabtree-Hayes. But firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on Yagara Turrbal country here in North Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge the elders, past and present, who have cared for country and cared for kin since time immemorial. Also like to acknowledge the emerging elders and young leaders who are continuing their custodial responsibilities, practices, and acknowledge that NENA has a rather wonderful Indigenous hub, Indigenous knowledge hub. And we've had remarkable folks like Mary Graham, Ross Williams and Barry Hunter, Victor Stephenson and others talking about different issues across the new economy. I'd invite you all to follow what has become a bit of a Zoom tradition, folks popping in the chat where they're from and whose country they're on. The New Economy Network Australia is a network of individuals and organisations who have come together over the last 5 or 6 years to build a platform for really important civil society-led conversations, peer-to-peer learning, collaboration and initiative development. We're really proud of what NENA's been able to achieve as a volunteer-led, volunteer-run cooperative. And it's really lovely to see some very devoted NENAites on tonight, as well as some new friends. And I do urge you to visit the program for the rest of the week. I'll pop it in the chat in a moment. But this evening, I'm really delighted to introduce Louise. Louise first gave a talk around this topic that she's about to share a couple of years ago. And the first time I heard it, it literally blew my brain backwards. I was fascinated with these notions that linear time and modernity and progress have literally caused the mindset that enables housing to become some bizarre investment as opposed to beautiful homes for everyone to live and be safe. So Louise, I might just hand over to you. And if you wouldn't mind introducing, I know you do so many things. I wasn't even sure which bit of you to introduce to this group. So I might just let you do it. And the format tonight, ladies and gentlefolk, is probably half an hour for Louise to give a really excellent overview of some pretty important issues. And then we can have 30 minutes or more for Q&A and discussion. Please do put any questions in the chat and I'll collect them. We've got an hour and a half, but if we wrap up around 7 or just after 7 Queensland time, 8 o'clock Southern time, that's okay too. So Louise, thanks so much for joining us. How are you tonight?
Yeah, good. Always good to be part of this. It's just such a great week and such an awesome event. So thank you yet again for having me and giving me the time. I really appreciate it and really looking forward to it. So I'm Louise Crabtree-Hayes. I'm based at Western Sydney Uni. And I research a whole raft of things around sort of housing affordability and sustainability, but really based on this fundamental idea. And I've got a croak, so hopefully I won't be too croaky, of how we rethink our relationships to place. And speaking of place, I'm coming to you from the wonderful Gadigal country of the Eora Nation, and I also want to acknowledge elders past, present and future, and extend that respect and acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folk with us this evening. Anyway, without further ado, I'll do the obligatory screen share. Now, I have got slides. I'm probably going to do a little bit of skipping through. Don't panic, I will send them to Michelle. So please don't feel you've got to be frantically scribbling down things that you see. Anyway, But yeah, I probably won't cover everything that's in these because I've been having a think about what I want to try and focus on tonight. Anyway, let's just get going. So what I want to talk about is this sort of idea of the current regimes of property value and where they came from. I'm going to have a bit of a chat about this fellow called the man of property, and then some of the implications in terms of housing as a commodity and how we might start to rethink value. So let's jump in. So what I mean by these current regimes of property value is basically the narratives and understandings of place and time and the world that are actually bound up in property. And when we think about property and what it is, it's essentially just the codification of a series of relationships. And we can think about this in terms of, I own this or you own that. But what does that actually mean? What does it mean to actually say that thing, to assert that position? So it sort of relies on an implicitly agreed framework. So it's implying that I am separate to you, because if I'm saying that I own something, it's kind of implying that someone else doesn't. So there's an implicit separation there between those two subjects. It then also implies that we're both separate to the things that we're talking about. So, I own this thing means that I'm separate to that thing, and there's this relationship between the two that's being set up. And that those objects, moreover, can actually be owned, that's in itself a thing that makes sense and is just taken for granted. And so this, it relies on this idea that ownership is actually understood as an act and as a relationship. So these things are all absolutely implicit in that statement. And so as you can see, there's a lot actually going on in these assertions, and nearly all of it is unstated and presumed. It's just assumed to be a natural order of things. But, spoilers, it's not. It's actually, as Michelle alluded to, it's actually bound up in these understandings of time and perceptions of the world. And so the key authors that I'll be drawing on are here, and there's some references at the end as well. And so this sort of overall body of scholarship shows that there's this sort of implicit understanding of what's called disjuncture. The future is separate to now, which is separate to the past, and that time is always moving in this absolutely irreversible sequence. So time moves from the past through the present to the future. And these are absolutely central tenets of both modernist ideas of progress and everyday time constructs. Again, they're just not questioned. They're just assumed to be natural. And what we've seen as a result of this sort of assertion and understanding of the world is that it's actually translated through into really foundational understandings and enactments of property. So, for example, the enclosure of land, which has sort of been fundamental to the expansion of colonialism and capitalism on that basis, was actually predicated on this idea of movement towards betterment. So what I mean by that is this sort of sense that in these narratives, this linear progression of progress, the past is inferior to the present, which is inferior to the future. Although interestingly, we could talk about whether that's now getting disrupted by things like climate change, for example. But that idea of progress is sort of deeply ironic, and that the future, which is held to be the site of perfection, never arrives. So it sort of puts everyone on this spinning sort of running wheel, trying to get towards this idea of betterment. And so you hear this sort of highest and best use in terms of what land is enclosed towards. But this idea of betterment is sort of cruelly ironic, because you can actually never get there. And that's sort of the progress narrative. It's just the goalpost is perpetually sort of disappearing over the horizon. And these are very much inflected with and emerging from Judeo-Christian sacrifice narratives. So the idea that sacrifice in the present or suffering in the present is actually the prerequisite for that future heaven or that future reward. So you can see there's the justification there for some pretty poor practice on the basis that the reward will come later. So it's this sort of dislocation from place. And so these have all had a crucial role in both colonisation and the construction and enactment of property law. And so you can see these sorts of quotes, from these authors. Graham saying that the Enlightenment idea of progress has become the rationale of colonisation and the measure of civilisation. So we sort of rank people according to the extent to which they follow these narratives as well. And Nick Blomley picks up on this and says, private ownership is seen as good to the extent that it fosters valued behaviours, including responsible citizenship, political participation, and economic entrepreneurship. By extension, people who don't own property are treated with a good deal of ambivalent suspicion and even hostility. And so you can hear that in appeals to these sort of homeowner societies, and the idea that that is where the good citizen, in the job, that's where they live. And Debbie Bird Rose, I cannot recommend this book strongly enough. It's called Reports from a Wild Country. Again, I've got the references at the end. Does a brilliant breakdown of this. And so she talks about history as this being constructed as a process of conflict and change, such that the present emerges from and is differentiated from the past, and such that the future will emerge from and be differentiated from the present. It puts a positive value on change and posits that history or society is moving towards the resolution of conflict and contradiction. So again, this idea that we'll get there, we'll get there, we'll get there, never let's be here, we are here, what are we making now, what are we doing now? And it's this constant sort of dislocation and disjuncture. And she talks about this present as a hapless moment with a constant deflection to an idealised future, which really empties the present out of meaning and purpose and value. So what does all that mean? It really creates this idea of progress and improvement. And so this underpins the entirety of pro-growth narratives, and the assumption that monetary interpretations of value will increase over time. We have to have economic growth, we have to have economic growth. It's all based on this idea of betterment and improvement rather than emplacement and thinking about different values of being emplaced. So what it's saying is that if property is the codification of relationships, it's only recognising some forms of relationships. So often it's talked about exchange value over use value. So what I can trade this for rather than what purpose is it serving. And as a result of that, the relationships that are foregrounded are based in exchange and speculation rather than reciprocity and embeddedness. And as I was sort of saying, it sort of relies on this disconnection between people, things, and places, this idea that things can be excised from those contexts and traded. And as a result of that, it renders certain ways of being and doing illegible, disregarded, or unacceptable. And this very much sets up the terrain and conditions for exploitative relationships. So then who's this man of property that I was talking about? This is a really nice paper by Val Plumwood, who's basically constructed this idea, this person, as the archetype of humanity that's upheld in those ideas of property. And it really encapsulates that separation. I think that's the thing that really appeals to me. And what she says is the man of property constitutes as excluded a certain range of others, because the concept of property has built into it the denial and appropriation of certain backgrounded kinds of prior contribution or labour, and requires the continued representation of this contribution as inessential and the subsumption of those who make it within the master's sphere of end. So what that's saying is what upholds property is actually a whole bunch of stuff, people's work, people's lives, the work of the lives of non-human beings. All of these things actually uphold it, but they're all erased. They're all sort of sidelined because of this singular, individualized, heroic personality at the center of the narrative. And so she's just sort of throwing light on that and saying, this person is, it's surreal. It's not, that's not how society operates. So property ownership does not just refuse to see or acknowledge others, it also appropriates their labour, and that's the second part of it. So it renders that labour invisible and invaluable, but also kind of relies on it and needs it while also denying its value. It's really quite, like I said, an exploitative relationship. So if we think about the labour that's being talked about, there's obviously all this physical actual labour, like I said, which is rendered invisible, but then there's all of this water and energy and all of these non-human lives that are also bound up in it. So you can see all of the things that go into actually enabling housing to continue, whether it's the actual the conditioning of the built form, or even things like the transportation of the goods and services that are consumed in the home. These are all sort of rendered invisible. And you can see here, this was a consumption atlas that the Australian Conservation Foundation used to do, looking at what actually goes on in housing in terms of energy and water. And you can see all other goods and services in both of these taking up a substantial amount of both the water and energy that are consumed in the house. And so the reason I'm sort of foregrounding this is to step into what we're next going to talk about, which is housing as a model and a site of consumption, and also the incredible amount of throughput and waste that's generated by this rendering invisible of all of these things that are going on in this image here. And so the man of property as this constituted subject really relies, as I said, on that hidden labour, but was also post World War II, very much assumed to be in a freestanding home that was actually a nexus of consumption. So you can see here a quote from Iris Marion Young, who I forgot to put in the list, so I'll make sure that goes into the slide before I send it out, who talks about this as a very conscious post-World War II construction, where individual homes predicated on this male breadwinner with all of these hidden forms of labour propping that up was a very conscious strategy by industrialists. And you can see the quote here that says, "The goal of a dream house sets workers working and keeps workers working." And I'll just wait for this playing in case my vocals drop out. It's called a Marrickville moment. So the industrialists were actually on record asserting that the demands of home maintenance would also undermine and counter union organising. So it was not only setting up the basis for consumption, but also countering any challenges to the conditions of the labour of the workforce. So as I said, there's all those real and virtual labour, the energy slaves, and all of those sorts of things. But this very conscious creation of the home as a space for consumption. So Dolores Hayden saying union leaders and manufacturers agreed that a more spacious, mass-produced form of housing was essential to enable workers and their families to keep consuming. So we get the guys in the factories building the white goods. Now the factories have been repurposed after the war. We put the women in the homes doing all of this housework, and we create the market for those white goods, and it's all predicated on the separation out of those previously shared living spaces. So this very individualist and expansive and exploitative sort of paradigm that was set up. So I won't go through this too much. This is all Dolores Hayden's work, and again, I'll make sure that's in the final slide. But it's really this work-consume nexus that's been set up on the basis of this privatisation of living space. And in this, because I want to sort of start segueing into this, how do we rethink value? So Hayden's take on it was that the house ended up as a box to be filled with commodities, this sort of privatised sphere, lots of replication of spaces that were previously shared, and absolutely no concern for or awareness of the resource base. And value here was very much size and location. How much house can you get for your money, and then what can you sell it for? How many gadgets and widgets and things can you pile into it? And so, there's a whole Dolores Hayden, I love her, but I should keep focused. So when we're thinking about, the sorts of values that got bound up in this, it was a disposable, cheap oil, high consumption kind of landscape. So we saw inbuilt and perceived obsolescence, goods that will break, goods that you feel that you've got to swap out. And again, that you can hear echoes of that value being placed on change and transience, and you've got to get the better thing, you've got to get the better thing. There's nothing wrong with technological innovation, but you can hear this sort of frenzied search to just keep constructing the basis for more stuff. And very much trading on the fact that we're social creatures. So, they've got the new iPhone. Oh, I better get the new iPhone. And it makes us really anxious. It makes us really unhappy. And we've seen that where people are set up in this competitive system, it doesn't matter whereabouts on the social ranking you are, it's going to make you feel unwell. So even if you feel you're winning, you're still going to be stressed and anxious because you're thinking, oh my goodness, someone's going to displace me. So it's not actually any good for anyone to have this sort of competitive framing. So we've got a suburban and urban form predicated on an economic basis that's physically unsustainable and makes us sick. So, Houston, we've got some problems, as well as all of these problematic gender roles and behaviours and identities that were inscribed in it. So, what we've wound up with is a housing system where the balance as a result of this is tipped very much towards this speculative and developer-led model rather than the more deliberative and place-based models of development. So we see housing itself start to become a commodity. So it's not just the box to be filled with commodity, but in itself it becomes a commodity. And so we then get these secondary markets of abstracted financial products, trading around the globe on a lightning scale. And they're only able to be traded due to their disconnect from the places and people bound up in them. But what we saw at the start and the rollout of the mortgage crash, when that went down, it directly impacted back on the communities and the bodies of the people living in those homes. So we saw this absolutely catastrophic reassertion of those connections that were being hidden through the processes of commodification, where mortgage bundles had been packaged up and traded on as abstract speculative commodities. And then once the value of that imploded because of unemployment and people's inability to pay mortgages, and also the absolute overinvestment in housing, what felt the brunt of that was those bodies and those communities. So it's very much trading on an illusionary disconnect between cause and effect. Now, in Australia, this focus on home ownership and speculation is actually a very recent political and policy phenomenon. It's a post-World War II thing, very similar to the USA, which is where Dolores Hayden's work was based. Very conscious changes in our policy setting. So a shift from subsidising public housing to the private housing system through the tax system. We're also now in a situation where our welfare and social service provision also scaffolds this. So less pension, because there's an assumption you'll have private superannuation, and that has triggered a massive overinvestment in housing as a buffer because of the erosion of the welfare base of the state. So you can see there's this rippling out of that system into our social service. And so what we're starting to see is this persistent sort of decrease in home ownership. This is the ABS figures in the pie chart. We're seeing an immersion, and you can see that renting is growing. They're now on par with people who own without a mortgage. We've got a growing renter class, but commensurately we've got a growing rentier class, who are the people who own those properties that are being rented, either with or without debt. So we've got this very curious political landscape now, I think, where those interests may or may not be in alignment with each other, but we're seeing a shift away from simply thinking about you have to own things. And interestingly, we've seen literature internationally showing that renters have higher levels of civic engagement. Their expectations of capital gain are changing, and what they put more value on is agency and the quality of the home and their ability to make change, rather than, am I going to get a return out of this? Now, whether that's because they've given up on trying to get capital gain, or whether it's actually, I think it's an interesting sort of shift that's happening regardless, in terms of, well, do we actually need that, or are there other things that we can value? Rentiers, the people who own those renting properties, are older, and it's becoming increasingly more concentrated in a smaller number of older demographic cohorts. It's basically the over 65s now that are the only group in which home ownership is increasing. Literally everyone under 65, the rates of home ownership are decreasing, which is an extraordinary change. But both renters and the rentiers can benefit from stable and predictable rental terms. So I think there's an opportunity here for us to actually start thinking about other tenures apart from ownership and what they enable in terms of the relationships between people and place. So are there ways to channel this investment away from individualised to collectivised provision of stable long-term rental housing, for example? Can we start to open that space up again? Brief little graphic showing just how lousy our rental system is when you look at it compared to a lot of other wealthy nations. So in terms of its stability, the notice periods, pet ownership, all of these things, our rental system is very much geared against the rights of the renter. So I think there's a lot we can do in this space to improve it. Another brief interlude. This is the Anglicare affordability snapshot showing that basically no housing is affordable to people on Centrelink benefits except during the COVID supplement. So the decision to put people in poverty and keep them there is very much a political choice. But anyway, back to our core topic. So value, and I'll start to sort of get towards my last few points so that we can open up to Q&A. This was a rezoning, and this is just showing how value is constructed and enacted in our property system as it's currently performing. So this was bought, this is a site in Randwick, bought in 2006 for $6 million, sold in 2015 with a DA, a consent, for $290 million. So it sat there and literally did nothing for 9 years and returned a 4,874% value uplift to the owner who put in a DA. So in terms of what did that person contribute value to society? Questionable. What did they get back? Megabucks because of an act of government to approve a DA, which was approved for 750 dwellings. So very strange value signals happening here is what I'm saying. So how do we rethink value? How do we start to move into the sorts of things that we would like to see in a new economy? So we want to move away from speculation. That kind of nonsense is just madness. So how do we rediscover the relational aspects of property and start shifting the system accordingly? So this involves thinking about who is served by these value configurations, including the non-human, and how do we start to shift them? So do we think about past and future generations and that more expanded understanding of an embedded now where those past and future generations are already present and already influencing what's happening? How do we embody and promote non-exploitative relationships of mutual respect and care? And how can these become the markers of value? Can they actually become the markers of value? Because this is the work that I think is crucial. So we're starting to see things emerge. We're starting to see things like performance ratings in homes on new builds. So can we think about, not just the energy performance, but does this property configuration promote reconciliation and healing? Does it skip a bullet point and go down to carbon sequestration? Can we extend it to existing homes and mandate labelling? Because at the moment this is very piecemeal. This is not universal. Can we attach values to things like perpetual affordability, universal design, the SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals? What other ways of signalling and tracking the value of property regimes can we start to think about? Now, the issue is the market is not yet functional. So we need to be thinking about it in such a way so that the types of property that we want to see is also affordable. And we're not getting an elitist market happening because it's top dollar and capital floating to where it wants to go. How do we really bed it down into the things that are delivering the equity outcomes that we want to see? And obviously there's the issue of the existing housing, which in many cases is just terrible and may not actually be fixable and may need, to be rebuilt. But if these other registers of value become more, start to exceed the current configurations, maybe we'll then have the justification for doing those retrofits. But obviously, we need to be thinking of things like how we get the broader system to shift. How do we get real estate agents to think differently? How do we get banks to think differently? Developers, the media landscape, all of the things that are currently upholding this and feeding off it and, you know, reinforcing it. How do we start to trigger those and help build those shifts as well? Okay, so the very last thing I'm going to do. Yeah, well, we just got that. Community land trusts, love them. The reason I've got this up here is because I think this is how we can start to think differently about value. So community land trusts, they basically are a mechanism for starting to unpack value and allocate it accordingly. So what you can see here is the CLT is the thing that holds the property. It then issues and oversees agreements to people who are occupying, you know, what's above the ground, basically. So it's really about identifying and distributing value. And so there's relationships and overlaps between the individuals and the organisations that are bound up in it, but also they're involved in housing and other appropriate activities. So you could have tourism, you know, carbon-based sequestration, carbon sequestration, et cetera, So you can, all of these would have value flowing through them. And so you can then write into your leases or your deeds or whatever, the organisation holds this much, you get that much. So I think there's incredibly interesting work that can be done in this space to look at how we actually unpack that. So what I'm going to do is, you can look up the case studies later. They're wonderful, they're beautiful, love them to bits. I want to get to my last slide, thinking about how we think about the market. So how do we think about these new forms of value? What forms of non-speculative or degrowth markets might look like on that basis. So how do we actually start to build the markets that we need to? How do we place higher values on non-extractive or regenerative practices, including things like affordability? So you really want to separate the use value from the exchange value and look at ways of restricting the latter. Now, I've been talking monetary values, so do we start to need to actually encode non-monetary value registers into this landscape, and how do we do those? There's obviously a role for the state here, and the state moving away from that expectation of you owning your home. And so we need to be thinking about our welfare settings and our retirement settings, but also things like stamp duty and these things that at the moment are all geared towards particular forms of property value. So then it's really about enabling systemic change. So like I said, it's diversification of tenure and form, but also of that broader housing ecosystem and starting to change that. And a massive role here for cultural change. So how we recognise the role of home as shelter and housing as human right, and rethinking what it means to actually dwell in a landscape and be responsible to that landscape, and to actually help that landscape to thrive and create a value register that operates on that way. So it's really about conversations and engagements with other forms of value, and I will leave up there. There's a couple of things missing off that, so I'll make sure I add them in so you've got the whole gamut. But I will stop there and stop that share as well.
Well, thank you, Louise. And as promised, that was mind-blowing and very, very full of information. We've got a couple of great questions coming in, and you'll have to forgive me, folks. I've just got a few things I'm juggling, so if my head looks large or small, it's because the light behind me is changing. Louise, before we go to some great questions from folks in the group, can we come back to that image of the Community Land Trust?
Yes.
If you don't mind.
Certainly.
What I wanted to do was perhaps dwell on it just for a couple of minutes and talk about how it differs from the current model. Because I mean, I know myself, when I first started to engage with the idea of community land trusts, I wasn't that familiar with how it was and how it was different. So even just that picture.
Where'd it go? Where'd it go? There it is.
There it is. So can you speak to this and maybe even use your mouse to point to things and explain?
Yes.
Right now, we know that property prices are driven by this idea of future markets, this idea of ownership separating out those that have the money and those that can invest and those that do not. Can you, by using a community land trust as an alternative, do a sort of compare and contrast of the different elements and why CLTs, as they are fondly called, really change that dynamic of land being bought and sold versus land being rested, respected, and a solid base for people to live.
Certainly. Can I actually, I'll do very briefly on here, but then I'll actually dive into one of those case studies and give that a couple of minutes.
I think that would be good. And then I'll go to the questions that people are asking.
Sure. So basically, so the CLT as the underlying property holder, it's actually a constituted non-profit. So, and it can have a vast membership. So anyone who lives in the area that the CLT serves and who believes in its mission can join the organisation. So then you've got this big public voice or community voice that's talking about, well, what do we think we want this portfolio of property to do in perpetuity? And that's sort of written into their definition both in the USA and the UK, where they've got these very broad definitions that say we provide community benefit and permanently affordable housing. So what it means is that organisation then has to say, well, what does community benefit mean? And so there's instantly a discussion around value. What do we want to see here in perpetuity? What are the things that matter? And that's why you see all these spin-off things that CLTs do, because they'll say, well, yes, we want to do affordable housing and we need to do rentals and we need to do home ownership, we're going to do co-ops, whatever, according to the gaps in their local housing system. But then people will also start saying, well, we've also got people who don't have access to good food, or we've got kids who need access to employment. And so you'll get these other uses starting to happen because of that articulation of what is being considered of value by the community. So the CLT will hold the underlying property, but then say, okay, this person who lives in this home, they can own this on a perpetual lease from us. So it's a relationship on an ongoing basis. Yes, you own it through this lease, but we've got the lease. So it's this immediate and ongoing and inheritable relationship. And it's a really nice video about this where one of the CLT residents says, I know I'm part of a bigger thing, and I know that when I die, my children will inherit this relationship, so the value is in that relationship. And there's also an equity component in there. If people put equity in, then the lease will say, when you sell this, the equity will be calculated according to this formula, but that formula will be written in such a way that it's not pricing the next person out. So there's a broader future buyer population being considered in the articulation of that resale formula. So there's these myriad relationships that are bound up in it. The big community voice of the trust, in which the resident is also a member, so they're in there as well as the broader public. There's the future generations. So there's these ongoing conversations, and all of it's bound up in terms of membership documents, leases, deeds, all of these things that act in perpetuity and keep upholding that relationship. So it's a very different thing to, this is mine, and at some point I'm going to flip it for megabucks. It's, I have these rights and responsibilities, but I also know I have these obligations to the community and to the system that has enabled this home ownership, because home ownership just doesn't magically appear out of, it doesn't just emerge out of the ground. Like, oh, look at this, I own this. There's a whole legal system and your ability to have money and all of these things that enable that to happen. So it's just being absolutely overt about those relationships and making sure that the ones that are upheld are the ones that are working for that organisation. So
Louise, I know you're going to give an example, but would you say then that by changing the capacity of land to not be used as a speculative thing, you suddenly inject a complete sort of, it's been a very long day. It actually injects into the cyclical nature, the endlessness of property prices increasing. It puts a stopgap in there and just suddenly says, no, this will no longer do those things. It will be sitting here looked after, and people will come and go on it. And I actually really like that idea, the idea that land is almost being set to rest instead of I mean, it's not exactly ecological, but it is set to rest instead of being this constantly moved and buffeted thing that then creates this imaginary world of endless growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, CLTs haven't really gone there yet, but they're starting to, in terms of how we then, because I think what they are really beautifully positioned to do is take that next step into putting a value on regenerative practice and actually articulating that value flow. So you can imagine here, like I've got, you know, regenerative land practices and carbon sequestration, for example, clean energy generation and so on. So, and some of there are things that I think are starting to step into this space, like the Aboriginal mob who are doing the clean energy generation on country. I can't remember who, but anyway, there would be ways to, you've got the CLT holding the land, something like a co-op or what have you says, we're now going to do regenerative agriculture on this, or we're going to do, reforestation for carbon sequestration. And that activity is the thing that generates the value. And so the co-op or what have you can say, okay, well, this is we will be the thing that trades in that value, sitting on top of the land, and the land is here in perpetuity to enable it. And so if you want to buy or sell shares or what have you, you can do that in that thing, in the co-op or the entity that's doing that regenerative activity. But you don't get to speculate and displace on the basis of the land. So I think there's really interesting ways to think about creating for purpose vehicles that are in partnership with each other and tapping into things like the impact investment funds or so on, to actually put more carbon down into the ground, to heal country, to generate affordable housing, rather than just flipping the soil on the basis of where it's sitting or public policy or what have you. So
thanks, Louise. We've got a couple of questions about community land trusts. Then I'll go back to some of the earlier questions that popped in there. Nikki Thompson's asking a question that you've kind of spoken to a little bit. She says, is the community land trust model being used at all with large-scale rural agricultural land?
It not large scale. It tends to focus on I'm sorry, I'm clicking on the wrong things. I'll stop my share. Because it tends to focus on regenerative practice. At the moment, it tends to be small scale, but sort of at the scale of getting up towards community farms or community supported agricultural schemes, but not broadacre cropping, largely because broadacre cropping is kind of antithetical to the ethics of it in a way. It's monocultural, etc. So it's at the moment it's smaller scale.
Kevin, thanks, Louise. Kevin's asked or said, we have the effect of a land trust in the ACT, but it doesn't work because it's too large and is not controlled by the people who live there. What's the best size of a community land trust? And I guess I would add the governance structure would matter, obviously.
Yeah. So great question. In terms of best size, I don't know there is a best size. I think it is more about your governance structure, because we've got CLTs that are everything from, a couple of dozen homes through to 2,500 homes is the biggest. And that's across 3 counties. They're kind of salt and peppered all throughout their service area. And that one's got about 3,000 voting members. But the thing that makes them work is the governance structure, which, in the sort of classic model is this 3-part thing, which is 1/3 residents of the CLT homes who are members of the CLT, 1/3 members who don't live in the homes but who believe in its mission, and then 1/3 that are sort of professionals and allies who are appointed by the other 2/3. So those 3/3 kind of balance each other out and make sure that no one interest gets to dominate it, whether it's the residents saying, that's fantastic, let's flip it all and move to the Bahamas, or whether it's NIMBYs taking it over and saying, well, we don't really like poor people, so let's just get rid of them, or whatever. You've got an ongoing forum for dialogue, which is the real strength of it, and making that structure really watertight. Scale helps with viability in terms of your finances, but again, that's sort of place dependent, and I think if we open them up to some of these more innovative value flows, that may not be the case as much. And we are seeing some quite significant interventions now in some of the European cities. There was a referendum to vote to move some hundreds of thousands of apartments in, I want to say Belgium, I'll need to dig it up, into a CLT. So we're starting to see some really quite extraordinary sort of interventions where public officials are realising they need to restructure their markets.
Thanks, Louise. We've now got a number of other questions, which I might move through. And then in the last 10 minutes, we might bring it back to the core topic, which really is how might we intervene in the Australian system to stop this endless increase in property values, prices. Obviously, the Community Land Trust is a great example. And we might even come back to those case studies you're going to mention before I rudely interrupted you with questions. Kevin has asked, this goes back to some of your earlier points, regarding higher levels of civic engagement of renters, how was this measured and where might I find a reference, please?
Yes, it's an academic called, I think it's Stephanie Stern. And interestingly, this is a really under-researched area. And I think it's really ripe for some more data. It's quite an old study. I'll dig it out, she says, and I can probably...
well, we don't want to put you on the spot, Louise. You can always add it to the slides. And
yeah, no, look, I've tragically got my bibliographic software sitting here open in the background. I'm just not sure if it's one. Here we go. There she is. Okay. Yeah, 2009, Stephanie Stern. And no, I need Zoom. There's Zoom. Okay. The paper is called this, Residential Protectionism and the Legal Mythology of Home by Stephanie Stern, as in Stern.
And are you able to copy and paste that into the chat since you've gone to so much trouble?
It's in the chat. It's in the chat.
Oh, good girl. Thank you, Louise.
And it's in the Michigan Law Review. Just email me, Kevin. I'll flick you the PDF.
Thanks, Louise. And thank you,
No
Kevin.
worries.
Rowan has asked or said, maybe the paradigm should be more like housing that allows humans to live their best lives, improving your life in the fields of technology, design, energy, water, waste, health, and products. Sounds like the Community Land Trust, this idea of intervening in that endless escalation of land and just let it settle down would allow people, hopefully with the right governance, to then say, okay, land is settled. Now we can focus our life on other things to be happy humans. Wouldn't that be nice? Just got another question here. Michael has raised some good points. He says, awesome presentation. Thank you, Louise. I see a lot of alignment with Aboriginal custodianship models with CLT, when no one had to sell their working lives to the wealth holders to buy the right for somewhere to live. My question is around tenure, relocating, and inheritance. If I have to relocate to another city, I lose my inheritance of relationship with the CLT. How could that be transferable to other similar housing?
Yeah, we just need CLTs everywhere. That is one of the challenges that they face in terms of people not, if they need to move to the other side of the country. But quite often, depending on people will often look for other CLTs, but not surprisingly, they are oversubscribed. They have waiting lists because people just love them. Depending on the circumstances, some CLTs will say, well, look, if you need to move interstate to look after, an aging relative, or you've got a job there for 2 years or what have you, they will let people sublet, but not at a profit. And you can't Airbnb it or any of those things as well. So there's a way to still have your home, and you're like, well, I've got to go rent in Perth for a couple of years, and then you can come back. So there are ways to enable that kind of flexibility, but obviously we also just need to have a bigger sector so that there are more of them that people can move around between.
Mm. And we've got a couple of questions now that might take us away from CLTs and into other suggestions of how we do this. JP has asked, what do you feel it will take to shift our thinking from price and speculation to value and care? Will it take some kind of crisis? What I'd like to suggest, we're already in a crisis, but the property markets don't seem to care. So Louise, obviously there's the cultural aspects of if everyone woke up tomorrow and no longer believed that the future was going to make things more expensive, we might live quite differently. And I once asked a wonderful Indigenous elder, what do you think would happen to Western culture if we actually understood multidimensional or non-linear time? And she said, well, you'd all slow down an awful lot.
Damn straight.
Yeah. But the question, what do you think it will take to shift the entire either Australian mainstream or Western system to think differently?
Look, I don't know that there's a single thing that it'll take. I think change in a complex system is always multifaceted, and I think it's I once read a very equally annoying and reassuring paper in about 1995 that was setting up a critique of development and said it's only going to come down by all of us chipping away at it. And I think that for me means everyone basically doing what they can, and because you don't know which bit's going to give, because it's a complex system in change. So we could all be tapping away thinking, we've got to reform rental tenure, and suddenly the global market collapses, and it's like, well, that's an opportunity. So I think the more we can start to push on the levers that are visible. So we know there's a housing affordability problem. We know that demographically it's shifting, and there are both more people renting and more rental homes that are owned by an increasingly capitalised rentier class. So what channels does that open up to us? How do we push on those sorts of levers? How do we push these public conversations? How do we just get visibility around alternatives? I think, what it is, and again, the way systems shift, it may be gradual or it may flip. We may hit a tipping point. So I'm sorry, I'm a systems theorist. No,
but I think, in reality, that's definitely the approach that those of us who've created and supported NENA is the idea that it is in fact a multiplicity of chipping away. And, you pull one thread, housing affordability, and you open up other threads, the systems connection with, domestic violence, with transportation. So,
and it could well be things like truth-telling and treaty-making processes. What is the basis of asserting a treaty if you've got a property relationship that's exclusionary and based on the myth of terra nullius? It could well be that offers a massive avenue into the conversation as well. So,
and a completely different cultural worldview. That's right. Kevin's actually asked a question a little earlier, which is, I think, connected to this idea of all the different factors that might contribute to the housing costs. He said, how much is the increase in housing costs caused by the limited investment opportunities of the middle class? That's kind of assuming that people want to invest, I think. But Louise, thoughts?
That's a Peter Phibbs question. But I think I can't put a number on how much is attributed to a particular phenomenon. I think the bigger issue is the constellation of policies that presume that's what you're going to do. The low interest rates, the favourable tax settings, the erosion of the welfare base, so that people think, oh my God, I've got to get into the housing system, or I'm going to be homeless in old age, or I'm going to have no pension, or I don't think it's because people can't invest in blockchain.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
Sorry, I'm just laughing at Jasmine's comment. It is a Peter Phibbs question. He could give you an entire lecture on it, but I think it's that other constellation of things.
So, yeah, that's good. Thanks, Louise. Jasmine has shared regarding agricultural CLT. Check out a new proposed project called foodvillage.com.au.
I will.
Yes,
I certainly will. And also thumbs up to the person who said that they're a broadacre regen grass-fed beef practice. Thank you. So good to see you online. That's brilliant news.
Thank you. The wonderful Maggie Shambrook, who has been working for women's access to housing and many other good things for many, many years, has asked, when land is purchased in the current system of private ownership, is it that we're really just buying the right to put or have an approved dwelling on that piece of land? If so, what's the collective ownership model that can provide, what is the collective ownership model in relation to this notion of land value?
Hang on, I'm going to have to read that one.
I think it's...
Sorry, I didn't make that very clear, did I?
If you want to say the question, Maggie, you're very welcome to speak to us.
Thank you. I was trying to type it quickly and I thought, but I guess what I'm saying or trying to understand better is there are great forces that hold the current status quo in play. In fact, one person who's an advocate for CLT said that $79 billion a year, can you imagine? That's huge, goes into private home ownership and investment subsidy. And I just thought, whoa, that is incredible. Can you imagine if we had that much money available to us to use for affordable social housing and other models? So when we look, the force that we're dealing with here is actually, it seems to me, about the force of private ownership as opposed to collective ownership or collective use of land. But in truth, it seems to me that what I was told, and I don't know if it is true, and that's why I was asking perhaps some with legal minds a bit or something, do we, when we purchase land, only purchase the right to have a dwelling on it or approved use of that land? An approved dwelling and approved use. That's all we're actually buying. We're not actually buying the land. So I was trying to mount an argument around the value then of collective ownership through community land trusts, I guess.
Yeah, no, look, it's a I mean, we do literally just get the right to occupy that and to flip its imputed value because of where it is and what you're allowed to buy on it. Which was the key point of that rezoning. And we see that whenever a mine gets announced and suddenly you're like, oh my goodness, I don't actually own this land at all because someone's just opened a mine on it. And so it is a fiction. It is absolutely a performative fiction. I think I once wrote a paper referring to property as the worst form of collective performance art that we've come up with, because it is. It's just this dance that we do when we all agree that we know what we're talking about, and it's just a fiction. And so I think, I mean, I guess the second half of the question, I guess, is it's not really that it changes into a collective form. It's more that it rearranges the relationships that are presumed to be upheld in the form. So if we think about the individual form where you don't actually own the land, but it's creating this myth that you do, it's creating this myth of exclusion, of highest and best use, that you can flip it in the future. If we shift it into something like a CLT, it's like we're actually going to throw those relationships under some light and we're going to say, actually, ownership is only legible because of a social agreement. So here's our social body that's making this agreement, which is a CLT. It thinks these things are important. And on that basis, as a resident or a homeowner, these are the things that you can get to stake a claim on. So it's just stepping into that space of this being a fiction and being a series of relationships that we're agreeing to, and saying, well, which ones of those do we actually want to prioritise, and who gets to lay claim to what, and on what basis. So it's just acknowledging that performative nature of it, and that social contractual relationship, and just stepping into that space and saying, okay, what do we do? I hope that answers your question.
Well, perhaps a follow-on question from me might connect to that. I'm aware that a few folks have dropped off, and we might even aim to wrap up in 10 or 12-ish minutes thereabouts.
Yes, because the moon's eclipsing.
Oh, the moon is eclipsing tonight. Oh, that's exciting. I don't think I knew that. Thank you for telling us, Lunar Girl. Excuse me. Connected to Maggie's question, and I guess all of this tonight. And look, NENA was created by civil society folks for civil society folks. We're not advocating to government. We don't rely on government to make the changes we want to see. We're very interested in how new examples of activities and peer-to-peer support can make change. However, given the single largest investment per year in our collective well-being could be federal budget spending and such, and I don't know if you want to comment on the recent budget and its housing program, which I've heard from others is insufficient, but what kinds of things could the government, let's pretend that you and I were in government, Louise, and we wanted to challenge notions of linear time, we wanted to challenge the escalating property values, what could government use as tools to focus on collective support, affordable, what are the solutions? Gosh darn it.
Yeah. Well, I think I guess there's a couple of things that are shaping up in my brain. One is the sheer, like the number that was mentioned before, the 79 billion, and how to start transitioning that out of current property configurations into other things. So you could imagine a transition process of starting to grandfather some of the tax settings, for example, and starting to send market signals. And that's why I think things like the labelling are really interesting, because if we could start to, if we think about, okay, we'll start putting mandatory labelling on housing and start having a market that's operating accordingly, and build in the countermeasures to make sure that we don't end up with people with lots of money being able to buy the good homes and everyone else getting garbage. You could start broadening what you label that housing as and the types of value that flow to it, and start signalling to the market, hey, this is shifting. And because the market will then start to adjust accordingly. And if you've got then things like, B Corp certified lenders, or, other ethically sort of aligned entities in the space, I think there are ways to start shifting those signals to the market. But then there's also things like getting rid of negative gearing. There's some really, there's so many articles in the conversation that you could just Google, what's a good housing plan for Australia? Hal Pawson at UNSW has this habit of writing really excellent lists, of 10-point plans to the federal government. Every time he does it, he's absolutely accurate. There's a range of things that can be done. Start reinvigorating the welfare system so people don't think they've got to pile into the property system to protect themselves in their old age. Start enabling resale restricted shared equity schemes. You asked about the budget. They did start talking about shared equity, but unless it's got a resale restriction in place, it's going to be inflationary. It's just going to push housing prices up, because all it does is increase demand. And those homes are not affordable beyond the first purchase, so you're kind of back to square one. Start to enable some of those flows of investment into the affordable housing space. I know they're talking to the super funds. Just crank that wide open and make it available. So to get to Kevin's question, make it available to people. If they want to invest in something, go invest in that. It's stable, it's regulated, it's all of those things. So there's myriad things that can be done to start to just think about, where do we want value to flow, and how do we signal to the market that that's where the value is going to be. Now, the problem's getting the bipartisan commitment to it so that you don't get, you know, the media landscape going, oh my God, the government's going to come and take you home, and, you know, completely derailing elections and all those sorts of
not
things.
to mention the rather significant lobbying that private developers and private interests.
Oh God, yes, we so need a non-profit development sector. We are so woefully lacking in non-profit developers in this country. Like, they are starting to emerge, mercifully, but boy, are we behind the eight ball on that one.
Can you give an example of a great non-for-profit developer in another place that does good things?
Oh, the Champlain Housing Trust, which was one of my case studies.
Where's
but there's they're in Burlington in Vermont in the USA.
What do they do?
They do home ownership, they do co-ops, they do co-housing, they do rentals, they do food shelves, refugee spaces, aged care centres, childcare centres, you know, blah, 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 blah.
And how are they funded?
They are funded partly by the city, partly by state schemes, partly by membership fees, partly by their own development fees because they do the development. So they've got this really diverse income portfolio. Some of it, they do charge commercial rent. So if they do like shops, you know, build a bunch of shops, and they'll charge those commercial rents. So they've got this really sort of diverse income stream.
But they
awesome.
focus on developing and creating places that people can actually afford to then buy and invest in. Right. I have heard of them. That sounds wonderful.
Yeah, no, they're very good. I'll just drop them into the chat.
Thanking you. We have an interesting question from Kit, which is, I think, a little bit more about the governance side of things, the human side of things, not the financial so much. Given the intergenerational trauma and complex trauma, which is connected to relational trauma, I'm well aware of the hierarchies and clickiness that form in certain communities and villages, especially when people think differently and others in the community don't want them speaking up. I'm curious how community land trusts differ when dealing with hierarchies forming and intergenerational trauma and the unfortunate conflict that arises in families and communities.
Yeah, well, they're not intentional communities. They're bigger than that. And you've got this big membership that's bigger than the people who live in the homes. So they're basically a non-profit developer with a really big democratic voice. And because of that governance structure, the directors come up for election every 3 years or so. There's elections, directors have to go through a training program, they have to be elected. So they're just not prone to those same sorts of lock-in that you get with those smaller organisations that operate like intentional communities, because they're just constituted differently. They're very much not those. They're bigger and broader and more like, you know, NENA, for example, you know, a big civic entity with a membership base, but then with a board that's elected and all of that professional development that runs all the way down through the organisation.
Thanks, Louise. And, you know, this is a really important question about how do we work together in new ways and different ways. And, you know, from my background in community development work, one of the big issues that we always used to face was a lot of folks in non-Indigenous Australian society are not used to collective sharing, collective ownership. Even setting up cooperatives is unusual. We're used to our own things in our own space. And it's a huge issue. If we're going to change the system, you know, there are many aspects of the way we think and work that need to be challenged and either improved or made better. And as a governance nerd, I'm, you know, always in support of nice, clear rules and a fair, transparent way to do things. And unfortunately, a lot of our families and smaller community structures don't have that because people don't think they need it.
Mm-hmm.
They think it's non-friendly and you know. Anyway, it's a really
I think the other thing as well is it's about understanding that the occupation of your home in a CLT is very separate from the governance of the organisation. So the organisation is this big company, essentially. It's just a non-profit, socially oriented company that you have an agreement with. But in terms of your home, that's your own business. You live in that home, as long as you're not breaching your agreement, power to you. So it's basically it's not really your landlord unless you're renting from them, but if you're in a home ownership situation, they're basically like the equity partner on your home, but they're not. It's a very, very different configuration. While there's that big collective voice around planning and governance and what do we want to see happen in our neighbourhood or our town or our state. So it's a different thinking. It's a different sort of, and it's very different to intentional communities where everything's kind of piled in and really intense and all on this one organisation where, you know, you're living together in some kind of format. You're also making governance decisions and finance decisions, and it's full on. Like it's a lot more. I guess because it's, like I said, it's stepped into that space of those relationships and said, okay, so which bits of this do what, and just helping people to live in their homes. Exactly. Sue got it. You can have privacy and shared resources.
Yeah.
And Rowan, maybe jump on and Google the Australian Community Land Trust Network. There's a Google group that you can.
Are you responding to his question about?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I was going to say that's our last question, I think.
Yeah.
Shall I read it and you can answer it? So
yes.
Rowan said he has a not-for-profit that wants to build with an open book process, profit sharing. If there are any interested parties on this call, how do we have this discussion with stakeholders ongoing to evolve ideas and solutions to our various household problems?
Yeah, well, there's the link to the CLT network for starters, because that's exactly the conversation we're trying to foster. And there's people in there sort of bouncing all sorts of things around, and hopefully some of those conversations can snowball from there. But also NENA Housing Hub, surely.
Hopefully, yes. Our little hubs try to generate these kinds of conversations, but yes. So, Louise, I'm about to get attacked by a very impatient puppy. And
he's been so patient.
He's been so patient. He's in my office with me, folks. So if you hear any yapping, it's not me, I promise. But I think we've come to a natural end with our questions, and just in the sheer vein of compassion on an evening when you want to rush out and watch the stars. Kevin has very kindly put the full eclipse time in there. But
Excellent.
Louise, thanks so much for this really provocative and interesting talk, and really grateful to you for your time. Louise is very much involved in NENA. She's part of the NENA, the Housing and Human Settlements Hub is a bigger hub now. And we do plan to do a whole range of systems, solutions, discussions next year. I'm not sure what else to call it. And I'm looking forward to picking Louise's brain more. So please, if you're not already on the NENA mailing list, do join it. We're going to be calling it NENA Town or NENA Towns. There's going to be a whole bunch of roundtables next year looking at particular issues and actually utilising the remarkable expertise in the NENA network, including the wonderful Louise Crabtree-Hayes, to really work through some of the things that NENA-ites should be talking about and could be working on together. Excuse me for the dog barking. So I'll say good night. Louise, did you want to just say a final word?
Oh, just thanks to everyone for always a great conversation. And like I said, I'll update those slides to make sure all the references are in and flick them out to Michelle. And yeah, just jump in and hopefully I'll see you around and we can make great things happen.
Indeed. So please stick with us, folks. We've got another 3 days of 2 days, 3 more days with 2 webinars a day. And we'd really love for you to come also to the roundtable, which is just a 1-hour chat on Friday, where we'll be getting snapshots of people's ideas and suggestions, and a lovely open way for you to pop your ideas into a Google Doc to talk further about the NENA Housing and Human Settlements work. So thank you, Louise. Thank you, everybody. Go out and enjoy that beautiful moon tonight. And yeah, lovely comments coming through, people thanking you for your awesome time.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
No, talk soon.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.